Africa's climate crisis, droughts, floods, and the forgotten frontlines. While global leaders gather in air-conditioned halls to debate carbon credits and net zero targets, a far grimmer reality is unfolding across the African continent. From the deadly floods in Nigeria to famine stalking the camps of Sudan, climate change in Africa is no longer a looming threat. It is a lived catastrophe. According to climate experts and humanitarian agencies, Africa contributes less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet it bears the heaviest burden of climate-induced disasters. The continent's most vulnerable nations, such as Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Mali, are facing a deadly trifecta: erratic weather, deep-rooted poverty, and systemic underfunding for climate adaptation. Sudan. Famine on the front lines. Sudan, torn apart by conflict and displacement, is now the epicenter of a silent climate emergency. As of June 2025, famine conditions have been officially declared in Zamzam Camp, North Darfur, affecting tens of thousands. Experts warn that 17 more locations in the country could soon fall into the same crisis. Conflict has disrupted food supply chains, but prolonged droughts and erratic rains have devastated harvests, making survival increasingly difficult. Malnutrition rates among children are skyrocketing. In a bitter irony, while aid agencies issue urgent calls, the world's attention is elsewhere. Sudan is a textbook case of how conflict and climate disaster reinforce each other, says Dr. Aisha Salim, an expert on humanitarian response fragile states. This is not just a political failure, it's a climate injustice. Nigeria, flooded fields and forgotten farmers. In Niger State and Mokwa, over 200 people lost their lives to recent floods, with thousands more displaced. In northern regions like Sokoto, prolonged heat waves and drying rivers have crippled small-scale agriculture, leaving over 31 million Nigerians food insecure. The causes? Inadequate drainage, poor urban planning, and intensifying rainfall driven by climate change. Entire communities are underwater, crops washed away, and livelihoods destroyed. We've never seen rains like this before, says Fatima Musa, a farmer from Kebbi State. The rivers overran everything. We've lost our homes, our crops, our hope. Somalia and South Sudan, between drought and deluge. Somalia is reeling from the aftershocks of the worst drought in 40 years, which devastated livelihoods from 2021 through 2023. Over 7 million people were affected, with 1.8 million children under 5 suffering acute malnutrition. In contrast, South Sudan was hit by massive floods in 2024, displacing over 65,000 people. Homes, schools, and health clinics were submerged, triggering outbreaks of cholera and malaria. This cruel cycle, drought one season, flooding the next, is the new climate norm in East Africa. The traditional systems of farming and herding are collapsing under this pressure, creating climate refugees in their own lands. Mali and the Sahel. Climate change meets security crisis. In Mali, climate change is not just a humanitarian issue, it's a security threat. As desertification spreads and farmland becomes unusable, tensions rise between pastoralists and farmers over dwindling resources. Climate stress is fueling violence, says a UN Peace and Security report. Armed groups exploit local grievances and water scarcity to recruit and destabilize entire regions. Despite being among the most climate-vulnerable countries, Mali receives less than 1% of global climate adaptation funding. The funding gap, a slow death sentence. Africa's needs are massive. According to UNEP, the continent will require $50 billion annually by 2030 just to adapt to climate-related challenges. But global financing remains paltry. Pledges made at COP summits have largely failed to materialize, and African leaders say their people are being left behind. You cannot talk about climate justice when the front lines are bleeding and the lifelines are broken, said an African Union climate envoy during a recent summit. Where is the global solidarity? While headlines focus on sea level rise in Miami or wildfire risks in Europe, the African climate story remains underreported, underfunded, and underserved. Droughts aren't just environmental, they're economic disasters. Floods aren't just weather, they're mass displacements. Famine isn't just about food, it's a policy and justice failure. Global climate policy must shift from vague pledges to targeted, scalable, and urgent action in Africa. That means expanding climate insurance schemes for smallholder farmers, building flood-resilient infrastructure in urban areas, supporting green energy and regenerative agriculture, funding climate resilience programs, especially in conflict zones. A continent at the crossroads, Africa is not asking for pity. It is demanding partnership. The continent holds immense potential for solar power, innovation, and sustainable agriculture. But without immediate intervention, climate change could reverse decades of development gains and trigger mass migration, conflict, and instability. Final thought. If Africa, the region least responsible for the climate crisis, is paying the highest price, what does that say about our collective conscience? How many floods must destroy homes? How many children must starve? And how many communities must vanish before we say, enough?